Please be mindful of how you use the chat box, considering we have a large group of people here tonight. We're going to be using the chat box to field our questions to Mr. William Berg. So we would really like there to be mindfulness around how it's used. If people ask the same question multiple times, we'll just pick one of those questions to ask, so we're not overwhelmed with questions. And now for tonight's event, we are going to be hearing from historian William Berg about the historical housing issues like redlining, racial exclusion covenants, and redevelopment that have led to the housing inequality we see in Sacramento today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mr. William Berg, and thank you so much for joining us tonight and volunteering your time. We really appreciate it.
All right, thank you. The screen should be up, and hopefully you can still see me, but there's a lot to cover tonight. At the advice of the organizers, I started out with Nissan and go pretty much to the present day. If we start running short on time, then we will cut things short a bit, but it should be about an hour or so, plus plenty of time for questions. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat, and then one of the organizers will be able to relay that to me. I'll try to do it in real time. But if we have too many questions, I may ask to move along. Now, for thousands of years before Spain or Mexico or their representatives arrived in the Sacramento Valley, this was the land of the Nisenan, who are sometimes called the Southern Maidu, but according to the sources that I've seen, the Nisenan consider themselves a separate community from the Maidu, who are further north, and from the Miwok, who are further to the southeast on the other side of the river. And it was this location on a borderland between two communities that John Sutter arrived in 1839. And when he did, he was coming in the wake of a tremendous disaster because there were acts of essentially unintentional biological warfare. I say unintentional because people didn't really know what caused diseases in that part of the 19th century, but a lot of diseases to which native Californians had no resistance accompanied trappers and traders and early explorers, and were absolutely devastating. Some of the conservative estimates of population loss were around 2/3 of the population, some as high as 90%. So imagine the devastation that would mean. In what had been the most densely populated place, or one of the most densely populated places on the North American continent, because the Sacramento Valley was so livable, so productive, so full of food that was just there. And so there was never any need for the Nisenan to develop agriculture. And because the valley flooded, they had permanent encampments that were occupied over thousands of years, but their structures tended to be things like these reed houses that were short-lived, easily replaceable, and they could be built with materials at hand very easily. That all changed with the arrival of John Sutter. Now, he showed up with cannon, and what the cannon could do was part of the physical intimidation of the Nisenan into what he wanted. But he was part of a small group, and he couldn't outnumber them, even with modern weapons. So he had to manipulate them, and this was something Sutter knew a bit how to do. Is essentially because they were on an edge between the Miwok and the Nisenan. The Miwok and the Nisenan occasionally were at odds, and so he played the two groups against each other. The Miwok had already had contact with the Spanish and didn't trust Europeans. The Nisenan principally only had contact with fur trappers and had a pretty easy time prior to Sutter's arrival. So Sutter, of course, gets permission from the governor of California, from the government of Mexico, for a land grant. And the land grant that he's given essentially gives him the entire area, and the Nisenan become his workforce. The term slavery to describe that goes back and forth. They weren't technically chattel slaves in the way that African slaves were imported to the United States and became in a permanent state of slavery, but they took all their land. They had to work for him. He paid them in script that couldn't be used anywhere else. And occasionally he gave their children away as gifts. That's not something you do to an employee. That's something you do to someone that you consider property. And so that essentially is how the land use changed from thousands of years of stewardship of the valley to John Sutter's fort. You can see a rough map of the area here. You can see the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers. He knew this was going to be a trading point. You'll notice that he had his fort up on high ground. We'll talk more about that later. Now, Sutter got into trouble with the gold rush because thousands and thousands of miners were coming in to mine, and he had no way to control them because he didn't have a military force, he didn't have a workforce. His workforce of the Nisenan, he had them work gold for a while, but the miners, the European American miners and people coming from all around the world descending on this region essentially chased them off and said they had no right to mine. And so Sutter was without a source of income, without a workforce, and his son, John Sutter Jr., who's on the left here, 22 years old, just come from Switzerland, didn't speak any English, gets the job of figuring out how to pay off his dad's debts, which were considerable, while dad went up to Coloma to try to find gold himself and to drink a lot. Mostly he drank a lot. So Sutter Jr. meets Sam Brannan, the second person there, who already had a trading post and became the first millionaire in California, who has a scheme to divide up lots and sell them off to these miners and to investors, and that money can be used to pay off the debts. They hire Captain William Warner of the Army Corps of Engineers, the third man on the screen, to draw up a town plat, and then the last fella on the right there, that's the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, and quite a royal jerk he was, but that's another story. But he became the principal sales agent, and both Burnett and Brannan were paid in a percentage of the lots. And this is the plan that William Warner drew along with Lieutenants Ord and Sherman. That name sounds familiar. Yes, it's the same General Sherman from the Civil War, but he started out in California, and he actually spent quite a bit of time in Sacramento. And as you can see, this is the center of this is the Sacramento Central City grid that we know today. These lots were sold off. The problem is it was sometimes lots would be sold, multiple lots would be sold to the same person, or the same lot would be sold to multiple people. So there's a lot of confusion and havoc about the lots themselves, and it started out early legal battles. But within the next year, so by 1849, a community of about 10,000 people and the barest bones of a city, J and K Street, that you can see here, starting to take shape. But 1849 was a drought year. 1850, not so much. And that's when the 49ers discovered that Sacramento, the part closest to the river, was a floodplain that was drenched pretty regularly. And that's why Sutter had built his fort a couple miles away. Another thing that arrived that year was a cholera epidemic on the sidewheel steamer, the New World, which complicated things and added to the tension in the area. And then the event took place. It's kind of a series of events, which I encourage you to look up in more detail, called the Squatter Riots. A friend of mine refers to them as the Settlers' Revolt. Is that this was a conflict between people who came to mine and assumed that it was essentially open land that they could claim or build upon, and people who had purchased lots. And some of the people who were involved in the Settlers Association were people like James McClatchy, who later founded the Bee, Dr. Charles Robinson, who later became a state senator, and Hardin Bigelow on the left was kind of the voice for reason and peace. He was the first mayor of Sacramento. And then August 14th, 1850 was when it all came to the head, what was called the Squatters' Riot, which took place around 4th and J Street. It resulted in the critical injury of Mayor Hardin Bigelow, who died a few weeks later of cholera in San Francisco, and several other people. This conflict was won by the investors, the people who had bought the lots from Sutter, who essentially had formed the nucleus of Sacramento's first business class. So some of these names are the same ones that later turn up involved in other investments, other speculative ventures in Sacramento, and sort of set the tone for land use in the city since then. 1852, city burns down. 1853, city floods again. 1854, city burns down again. This results in some new laws about building out of brick rather than wood, and this actually caused some consternation with the Chinese community, which had been there the whole time since the gold rush, really, and they didn't have the funds to build in brick, so that created some limitations on constructions in Chinatown. Now, every time the city flooded, there was a new village that would pop up instantly up near Sacramento State. One was called Hoboken, one was called New Sacramento. One guy, Sam Norris, named his Norristown very modestly. But every time that the waters receded back down to the Sacramento River, everybody ran down to the river because despite the fact that it flooded, it was a spectacularly good place to do business. And the point where the American met the Sacramento was a major sandbar. So it was the northernmost point into the state that large ocean-going vessels could travel. I mentioned the Chinese community had come there to mine, but very quickly they were locked out not only from mining by the foreign miners tax, even though the fact that there were plenty of people who had come from elsewhere from the United States who weren't charged that if they had come from, say, Europe. But if you had come from Mexico, come from China, then you had to pay the foreign miners tax. In addition, the Constitution and American law essentially said that you couldn't there were really only two colors. You were either black or you were white. And so there wasn't really a category for the Chinese. And so what the federal government came up with was the idea that they were aliens ineligible for citizenship. And so they couldn't become citizens and couldn't own property. And next land use was the first railroad in California, Sacramento Valley Railroad, along R Street. And here you can see an aerial view of Sacramento. And you can see that to the left is what's called Sutter Lake, or rapidly becoming China Slough, because right up against the swamp there on I Street was the only place where the Chinese were allowed to build. And on the southern end is Sacramento Valley Railroad running on a levee on R Street, which in 1861 caused a flood because the water came in from the north instead of the south this time, and it stopped at their levee. And here's I Street and what's called Chinatown or Chinadom, which, as I said, was at the edge of a swamp. And you can see, okay, there's another railroad here on the northern side. That's the Central Pacific Railroad. And that was the successful efforts of the Big Four to bring a railroad to California, or that started actually from California. People often say, well, Sacramento is the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad, which meant it ended here. No, it started here and went east. And there was no construction westward for another 2 years because the Civil War was still on. Here's, again, this is a view of Sacramento about 1870, showing sort of the general land use. You can see that the swamp is still there, but it was all given to Central Pacific on the promise that if they drained the swamp, and we actually ended up moving the river, you can see the new mouth of the river a little farther north, and the old channel that is indicated where the Southern Pacific shops are now. That area was all being cleared out and dried out because the railroad had federal funds and could afford to do all this. And the waterfront was rapidly becoming a highway and the most densely populated area because it had proximity to the main channel of transportation, the Sacramento River, and its array of riverboats. This is also the era of the 1860s and 70s when we started lifting the city upwards. The street raisings are relatively famous. You can take the tours in Old Sacramento, but the raisings of the streets went all the way back to about 12th Street. This is a bare earth map. The lighter the color, the higher the land here. You can see the levee along Front Street. You can also see sort of where things dip down in alleys and in mid-block, but a significant portion of the city from around I Street to L Street were raised up to roughly the area of the state capitol. You can also see the berm that the state capitol sits on, and further on, because this was done after the East End project, you can see the subterranean tunnels for the East End garages. And then after 1870, once the new street level was established, we could start having streetcars. Streetcars are a different form of transportation than just walking around, and they help drive development. They help drive urban growth farther to the east because you get back and forth on the streetcar faster than you could by walking. And when they transitioned from mule-drawn streetcars to electric streetcars, they could go that much faster, and it also drove development that much faster. We'll see that when we get to Oak Park. The kind of housing that was being built during this era, people are generally tend to think that, oh, the 19th century, everybody lived in a farmhouse, right? We were a farm town. Well, we were in a farm town. We were a city. And generally, if you didn't have a single family house, which was something that the wealthy had, but most people didn't, you lived in a hotel or a boarding house or other communal housing like this. This is the Capitol Hotel, or the Western Hotel here. And these were hotels for travelers, but they were also hotels for permanent residents. And they became the primary method of residence in a lot of the downtown core up through mid 20th century. This is an example of the kind of houses that you'd see during the horse car era. They tend to be very vertical and very narrow. That's partially because property taxes were based on the width of your lot rather than the total area. So if you had a narrow house, you paid less taxes, but also because you had to build densely in an entirely walkable city in order to get enough people into a small area to make the city economically viable. Here's another example. This is the Seth Babson House, which was later expanded after it was purchased by Leland Stanford, later governor of California and president of the Central Pacific. And these houses became very useful to subsequent generations. When China was cut off from immigration due to the Chinese exclusion law in 1882 and the Scott Act in 1888. The result was a worker shortage, but that just around then, around 1890, that's when Japanese immigration started, and they started moving into Sacramento, eventually making, by the early 20th century, Sacramento was not the largest Japan town, but in terms of percentage of population, probably the most Japanese city in the United States. And that started a cycle that Carrie McWilliams talked about in Factories in the Field, is that each new wave of immigrants starts out as, oh, they're a docile and helpful workforce, until they start to build a population and start to set down roots and families and wanting to own properties and businesses. And that's when they become the new yellow peril. And that cycle started with the Chinese and the Japanese, and then Filipinos, Indians, and so on. Basically, any time there was a new population coming in from Asia, they went through this cycle. And then eventually it ended up, of course, in Mexico. But this area that had been the original growth area of the city, the original residential area along M Street, that became Japantown on the other side of K Street from Chinatown. This is the Nagasaki boarding house in an alley off of M Street. And in other communities made use of existing houses. This is a house that's at 19th and S Street. It's still standing. It was owned by a German family who had a lot of kids, and it was sold to an African-American women's organization called the Women's Civic Improvement Club in the late 1930s for use as a boarding house, because single African-American women really had very few options in terms of housing that they were allowed to rent that was appropriate and acceptable and safe. And so they decided they were going to form a communal organization, buy this house, and live there. So very often old houses became the homes of new communities, or of communities that were in great need. A lot of the houses of this era were also commercial buildings. They were designed to look like residential houses that maybe had a store added to it. If you know where Naked Lounge is at 15th and Q, this is the same building, the Fremont Cash Grocery, and there was residential upstairs and commercial downstairs. And very often the people who worked downstairs, the family who owned the store, would live upstairs. Other times they'd rent it out to a third party if they had another house somewhere else. There was moves to move people out of the downtown core, which was very rapidly becoming very crowded and very industrial. This is Sacramento County Hospital, what's now it was the core, the nucleus of what later became UC Davis Medical Center on Stockton Boulevard. But it was located at the time far out in the fields with its own farms, its own potter's field, and far from the smoking industry of the waterfront. And the move towards more suburban, more pastoral, whether really pastoral or a simulated pastorality, became a driving force of the progressive era in the 20th century and later suburbanization. But there were other consequences to that as well. By the turn of the century, the city's expanding. You'll notice, I don't know if you noticed in the earlier photo, there was a racetrack in the upper right-hand corner. It's gone now. And that was one of the first redevelopment projects in Sacramento, a neighborhood called Boulevard Park. But before we talk about that, we're going to talk about Oak Park, which was located outside the city limits. And it is an example of what was called a streetcar suburb. Here's a streetcar suburb advertisement for Oak Park, and obviously you call it a streetcar suburb because it's too far from downtown to walk easily. So you run a car line out there. And during the late 19th, early 20th century, this essentially became a triple threat. You sell land, and then you sell rides on your streetcar, which originally this was an electric streetcar powered by batteries. The batteries didn't work very well, so they switched to oat-driven transportation pulled by mules. And then the overhead trolley wire was invented, which let them connect to a power plant at 28th and M Street. And later, a third part of this combination, suburban subdivision, streetcar line, and electric power generation. In this case, it was hydroelectric power from Folsom, which was much cheaper and much more abundant. So not only could you power your streetcars with it, you could sell it to the customers who you're selling housing to or industrial products to. And so this kind of development, the streetcar suburb pattern, became the pattern that expanded Sacramento beyond its original borders. And Oak Park was the template for that. Here is the originally the Central Street Railway, that now is the Central Electric Railway, located at 28th and M Street. It's still in use by RT today, but the building itself is gone. There is another car barn that's still standing. However, this was a risky thing. The developer who did Oak Park in the first place did it in 1888. A couple of years later, the Panic of 1893 wipes him out, and he ends up putting all of his properties in his wife's name, skips town, and is never heard from again. He basically just disappeared to dodge his creditors. But that was the birth of Oak Park. And after the transition from Oak Park, the horse car line, to Oak Park, the electric line, they want to advertise their electric product, so they create an electric park called Joyland, which has great electric rides and lights and all the other advantages that electricity could bring to your home, and you can be a customer too. What they didn't include were racial exclusion covenants. These later became features of suburbs, but Oak Park was originally unrestricted, which meant that George Dunlap, the African-American Sacramento native, could buy a house lot there. Reverend T. Alvin Harvey, when he came to Sacramento from San Jose, established the AME Zion Church in Oak Park, became the first president, the founder of the NAACP in Sacramento, also in Oak Park, and became the winner of the first discrimination suit in Sacramento in Oak Park. And he was also a resident. And then on the right is Ernesto Galarza, who's the author of a book called Barrio Boy, and was a labor organizer who's a major influence on Cesar Chavez, who, after his family started out in the old West End on the waterfront, also bought a house with Oak Park because it was open to them. Now, this was a little bit alarming for white communities. About the same time, 1905, I mentioned Boulevard Park, where the old racetrack was. It was also developed without racial exclusion covenants, but it was the first neighborhood in Sacramento that had what was called CC&Rs, covenants, codes, and restrictions. These regulated the size of houses, the scale of them, setbacks, and other what we call design review now. So it was mostly about the physicality of the buildings. And you'll notice that from the left to the right, on the left is H Street and the streetcar line, and to the north, to the right is the Southern Pacific Railroad line on B Street, and also there's another railroad, electric railroad, on C Street. You'll notice that the lots go from relatively large to smaller and more compact as they move to the right. And that's because the ones on the left are the most expensive. And it was expected that if you were going to buy one of the bigger properties on the southern end of the neighborhood, that you would build a more elaborate and expensive house. But they deliberately chose to make the lots on the north smaller in order to allow not necessarily laborers, but working people, boilermakers, shop workers, even in some cases, skilled tradespeople, to afford a lot. And they still had to build a house. In some cases, they brought houses from out of the way of the Western Pacific Railroad, which is being built through town, block to the west. But this was the first neighborhood that was designed inside rather than just the plain Sacramento grid. When he bought a lot in Oak Park, all he bought was dirt. So when George Dunlap bought his lot, he bought a plot of dirt, had to dig his own well, had to dig his own sewer, or his own leach field for a for the toilet and had to build the house. However, there were no sidewalks, unpaved streets. Boulevard Park, all the streets are paved with macadam, which is essentially decomposed granite. All the streets had sidewalks, and if you've ever been down 21st or 22nd Street, the most distinct feature of Boulevard Park is the landscaped boulevards in the middle of the street. Also, they rotated the lots 90 degrees. So most of the houses face the numbered streets instead of the rest of town where the lots face the lettered streets, because the assumption is that most traffic in Sacramento is moving east-west rather than north-south. And so because you're facing the lower traffic direction in Boulevard Park, you have kind of a little bit quieter home. The other restriction that was placed on Boulevard Parks, they were all supposed to be single family homes. This is not actually what happened. A lot of the houses that got built from the very beginning in Boulevard Park were duplexes or fourplexes. A lot of them are still there today. And then some were split and subdivided later or replaced with apartment buildings in the 50s. But that's because this was all private. CC&Rs and the agreements that were signed by an individual seller are individual. They're between the seller and the buyer. That's also what let people put racial exclusion covenants into law, because it wasn't technically segregation enforced by the government, right? Because the government isn't saying you can't buy here if you aren't white. This is a private agreement between two people. So all good, right? But they didn't do that in Boulevard Park. There were actually two African-American families that owned lots in the original development. There was a Chinese family who tried to buy a lot that apparently the neighbors found out about and talked the seller out of selling to them. So it's not like they weren't racist at all. They just hadn't thought to put this racist stuff into neighborhood documents yet. But subsequent neighborhoods, Colonial Heights, Halburn Oaks, what's now Curtis Park, right in Kimbrough Tract 24 in East Sacramento, all of these had racial exclusion covenants, or at least the overwhelming majority did. And the purpose there was essentially that you couldn't sell to anybody who wasn't white. Very often, in some cases, you couldn't sell to someone who wasn't white and Protestant, which means if you were Jewish, if you were Catholic, if you were Eastern Orthodox, you couldn't buy lots in those neighborhoods. And then later on, they became a little looser about that, where you just had to be white, but it was obviously still very racist. Here's right in Kimbrough Tract 24 in East Sacramento. Carefully restricted. I have been told that there was at least one African-American neighborhood within East Sacramento, but I don't have a whole lot of details about it. Meanwhile, downtown, housing is still being built, but it's largely called hotels. So hotels like the Californians, the Argus, the Shasta, the late 19th and early 20th century are sprouting up because there's a massive demand for small, efficient units for the massive workforce that is downtown, which is largely an industrial workforce, largely and very often a migrant workforce. This is a residential hotel or SRO hotel, single room occupancy. And this is a floor plan for one level of it. And this is kind of an early, maybe a later example, the early 20th century SRO. And you'll notice that it sort of has an E shape. And the idea there is that every room has to have a window. So they will create little voids, whether they're completely surrounded by the building or on the edge of the building, in order to have every room have a window. Because a big complaint about earlier tenements is many of the rooms were windowless. They had no source of fresh air. And the assumption then, like I said, people are still figuring out what causes disease, is that diseases were caused by miasma, by bad smells. And the other source of bad smells in these earlier 19th century houses before the flush toilet was commonly available was they would have, they didn't have an outhouse because they didn't have a backyard, but you would have essentially a toilet that would drop down into the basement, and periodically some poor guy has got to shovel out all the poop out of the basement, carry it away on a cart. But in this case, you can see there's a flush toilet, a water closet, and then the little oval that you see is a sink. And the idea is that the sink lets the individual in the room wash themselves and get drink of water. Very often men would also use them as a urinal, basically, but it provided a little more hygiene, a little more privacy than a boarding house or a large boarding space. There were also even cheaper hotels that they didn't even have individual rooms. It was more like a cubicle, where you have a cubicle wall that goes 6 feet high, and then you'd have chicken wire over the top of the cubicle, so you couldn't climb from cubicle to cubicle, steal other people's stuff. I mean, I guess if you had a wire clippers, but you leave a trail. But This became a very common sort of housing for Sacramento's industrial workforce, which, like I said, was very large, very mobile, and spent most of their time at work. So they really didn't need much more than a place to sleep. But there were other sorts of hotels too. And again, many of these hotels were intended not just for working class people, but for middle class people, that professionals, young clerks, working people in middle class occupations or starting occupations could get an affordable place to live. And so you have a middle class residential hotel, which you can see here. There's still basically one room, but they'll have their own restroom and their own bathtub, so it's a little bit better as far as hygiene and privacy. They still don't have kitchens, but generally the kind of life that you'd have in this neighborhood, whether you're in a working class hotel or not, was more of a social life. Your kitchen was a local restaurant. The laundromat was your washroom. The bar was your living room and entertaining, and or the street corner. This was people who lived primarily outside of their houses, and the apartment that was a small place that was affordable, and it was a place to sleep. But we also, because we were the center of government, we had to have another category of hotels, which are called palace hotels. Well, our palace hotels weren't quite New York's palace hotels. The idea is they still needed to have a certain level of elegance, because these were not only places where legislators could stay and lobbyists, but also people who maybe had a huge estate somewhere in the Sacramento Valley and they needed a pied-à-terre in Sacramento. But they were also a place, if you were a certain sort of an ambitious sort of young man who wanted to stumble across one of these legislators or lobbyists or wealthy people with large estates to do business with, in the bar or the restaurant of the hotel. This was a great place to live. And they were more expensive, more luxuriously appointed, typically not much more than one or two rooms with their own toilet and plumbing facilities, and also without a dining room. But why would you want to dine in your room when you could go hobnob with the hoi polloi in the restaurant? And then apartment buildings. And the old George Carlin joke is, why don't they call them togetherments? Because an apartment is self-contained. This kind of studio apartment, they're building them now again. Oh, it's a great new discovery. We can build really tiny apartments. It's an old idea that's just come back into fashion because we're coming full circle. We can see there's a small galley kitchen. There's folding beds. In fact, two in this example, so it's good for roommates. But the closet also functions as a dressing room, and there's a bathroom inside the closet. So there's plenty of space there for one or two people to live comfortably. But like I said, it's still pretty compact, and they're spending most of their time with their neighbors. This is the Maidstone at 15th and J Street, and it's an example of this kind of housing. Now, in the early 20th century, Sacramento was going through a little bit of a personality crisis, in that Berkeley had just tried to steal the state capital of California from Sacramento. And so this meant, well, what can Sacramento do to spruce up its image? So to do that, they hired three people, principally John Nolan, who was an early urban park planner. And he designed this plan to put these big diagonal boulevards through Sacramento. And very, very often these are plans that look good from airplanes, which had just been invented. So it's not like anybody was going to be much looking down at the city, but they're very geometric and very rational, but they don't necessarily pay much mind to what's on the ground or who's in the way of the development, which in large part, like I said, on M Street was the Japanese. And this was a plan for a grand plaza from the state capitol to the river over the, or to the bridge over the Sacramento River, that was done by Bartholomew and Associates. Bartholomew and Associates were hired in the 1920s, also part of the long range plan to have Sacramento get over itself, which introduced a lot of ideas about zoning to Sacramento. We already had racial exclusion covenants in the new suburbs, but zoning actually, instead of something that was voluntary and was a private agreement between a purchaser and a seller, zoning was something that was enforced by the city. And Bartholomew and Associates were big advocates of this as a citywide measure, and as something that was covered by force of law. And they also had a lot of really racist ideas about how cities should develop. And one of the things that the city had wanted to do from that initial burst of angst around 1910 through the 1920s was how to get rid of Japantown. And like I said, the Chinese were first, the Japanese were next. The Japanese they'd moved in for a while, but in 1907, 1908, Teddy Roosevelt entered what was called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was shutting off any sort of immigration from Japan, and especially preventing women from entering the United States from Japan and from China. And some of the laws that were passed during this era were intended on their cover, they were intended to discourage sex trafficking, which was a real problem in the Chinese community and later in the Japanese community. But the real issue, and a lot of historians are looking at this, is the real issue was preventing women from coming to the United States from China, from Japan, from other Asian countries, and starting families. Because if you're a single man from China, from Japan, from Korea, from the Philippines in the United States, you're isolated. You're working on your own, you're sending money back home, but your connection is still back there. If you're a man with a spouse, if you're a married family and you start having kids, those kids are now American citizens. And they aren't covered by the aliens ineligible for citizenship because they were born here. And a lot of California's racial laws and the United States' racial laws were intended to prevent that from happening in order to prevent Asian occupation and domination of the United States. There were a lot of fears about this, especially in the area around 1910 when the Gentleman's Agreement was signed. The issue became, how do we stop this new yellow peril that's overrunning Sacramento more than any other city? Racial exclusion covenants, really, they were intended to stop people by basis of race, not economics. Even if you're a wealthy person, this is William Fong Wei, who was a very successful shopkeeper and grocer in Sacramento's Chinatown in Yifao. And he wanted to build himself a mansion. And his original plan was to do it in Land Park, but he couldn't buy property because he wasn't Chinese. And there were some people who would occasionally try to get a straw buyer and do it secretly, but he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to build my mansion in Southside Park. It's still there today. It's now called the Inn at Parkside. About 1930, this is when it was built. And so his response, the response of this community, was instead of trying to buck the system, we'd find another way to do what he wanted to do. So he built his grand house, complete with a spring-loaded ballroom downstairs. And so the next response to communities of color in the United States, and this is a national response, was the Homeowners Loan Corporation's creation of what we now call redlining. And this was during the Depression. This was a Depression-era plan to provide money for people who wanted to buy homes because the Depression had cut off a lot of sources of income. And generally, before the Homeowners Loan Corporation, before FHA loans were available, you had to provide 20 to 50% of a home price as a down payment, and then you paid the rest over the course of the decade. And of course, FHA loans, for those who are familiar with them, it's a much smaller down payment, 3 to 5%. And this is also what instituted the 30-year mortgage that's still pretty much standard today. But part of what the federal government had to grapple with was, how do we assess risk? Where do we decide is a good place to give a loan for a house, and where's a bad place? And of course, America, still officially racist, decides that there are other factors like being located next to an industrial center or being located next to a land use that's not so comfortable, but also the racial composition of the neighborhood. And very often, because of reasons like the Chinatown being located next to the swamp in the 1850s, the least acceptable places to live were the places where communities of color were forced by social pressure to live. And that meant places like the West End. And so that red that you see on this map, these are areas that are considered really bad areas, and that no loan would be allowed. Yellow is questionable. Yellow is used to indicate communities that are ethnic white, so Italians, Portuguese, Greeks, and so on, that were considered close but not quite to being a community of color. Or places kind of in the middle ground. You can see Oak Park here. There's a large Italian community in Oak Park and this early settlement, as well as like I said, there's some people of color there as well. And the highest ratings are blue, which is all white neighborhoods that are really good physical condition, and that don't have things like industries and apartments near them. And green is areas that have racial covenants, and they're also in good shape. So that's the safest. And though this is really what shaped real estate development for the next couple of decades, because it started out just being a federal requirement for this federal program, but every bank in the country that did home loans started using redlining maps. And so this became a national standard. At the same time, the other Depression era programs are happening. Public housing is being created. This is the Dos Rios project just off of Richards Boulevard. About the same time, 1940, 1942, New Helvetia is being built on Broadway. And these are Federal Housing Administration, they're federally funded housing intended for workforces. They're both located, in the case of Dos Rios, it's near the Burkett Richards Cannery and other industries off of Richards Boulevard, north of downtown. In the case of New Helvetia, it's right near, there's lumber mills and other industries all along X Street and Broadway and the riverfront. So the idea was this was worker housing originally. That was the idea behind it. And of course, it was segregated. And then the war starts. And in 1942, Executive Order 9066 is released. All Japanese Americans have to, on the West Coast, have to report to prisons, basically. And this causes a massive shift in population, which also becomes an opportunity. Sacramento had always, like as I mentioned, already had a African-American population. It was about 1% of the city. But all of a sudden, this large portion of town, which is unrestricted, where you don't need to be white to own property, is being evacuated, and the people, the Japanese community, are selling at fire sale prices. And at the same time, there's a massive demand for labor in Sacramento, and African Americans who are looking for work, they flood into the West Coast to serve in industry, in wartime industries, in Los Angeles, in the East Bay. And here in Sacramento, we had a couple of military bases. We didn't make a whole lot of tanks or things like that. But guess what? An army travels on its stomach, and we make food. We can food. We put it into things that you can ship across an ocean and open it to eat. So that's what the labor force here was needed for. And African Americans came in, and the new residents of Sacramento also wanted entertainment. And one of the places that was purchased was the Zanzibar Cafe. And this was also a home away from home for African-American soldiers. We had two Air Force bases, Mather and McClellan, and I really need to look more into it, that there were a lot of African-American soldiers stationed at McClellan, not really many at Mather. And I was told that basically McClellan was the Black Air Force Base and Mather was the White Air Force Base. Whether or not that's the case, I'd still want to look into, but there were a lot, and they were also located at the Army Signal Corps base, which was initially where Burkett Richards Cannery was on off of Richards Boulevard. There's the owners of it. There's Nitz Jackson, and then the Andersons on the right, and another former Japanese boarding house, which had been previously the home of one of the vice presidents of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, was purchased by an African-American woman named Benny Twigg, who was very much a multiple entrepreneur. She opened the boarding house. She also opened a beauty shop. She also, because it was extremely difficult to hail a cab if you were Black in Sacramento at the time, so she started a Black-owned cab company. And she also, later on in the late 1940s, early 1950s, opened a record store, which was one of the first places in Sacramento to stock what were then called race records, which of course is the beginning of rock and roll. After the war, during the war, Mayor Tom Monk and the city council had signed an official decree, which was only rescinded about 5 years ago, that said that if the Japanese population of Sacramento was released from camp, Sacramento officially didn't want them back. The population said, tough, this is our home, we're coming back. And so there was an increasingly crowded downtown after the war and into the 1950s, both this larger African American population and the Japanese population. And they started new businesses, rehabbed older buildings. The Congo Club was, after the closure of the Zanzibar, the Congo Club was owned by Nitz Jackson and also Japanese American attorney Henry Takeda in a partnership. And it also brought veterans after the war, in this case, Nathaniel Colley, who had served in the Pacific during World War II, graduated from the Tuskegee Institute and from Yale as an attorney. He was not the first African-American attorney in Sacramento, but he was the first one to practice here, and he became a relentless crusader for housing justice. One of the first cases, one of the major cases that he tried was integrating New Helvetia. I mentioned it before. It was located on Broadway. It's still there. It's now a National Register district. And he led the charge along with a group of housing activists in the early 1950s. Previously, there were 2 buildings in the whole complex, which were for everybody who wasn't white, and the rest was for everybody who was white. And he opened the door to everyone. There were all other entrepreneurs who were building new buildings. This is Felix Flowers, is the fellow in the fez there on the left, and he was an African American member of the Elks, but the Elks Lodge in Sacramento didn't allow Black Elks to use their building, so he said, "Well, I'm going to build my own building," and it was going to be a restaurant, Southern food. I'm told the mint juleps are fantastic, but it also had meeting spaces for the Elks. Financially, I don't know exactly why it closed, but it only lasted about 3 years, and it became the VFW hall for Nisei veterans who, kind of like the African American Elks, were not allowed to join the Veterans of Foreign Wars chapters here in Sacramento that were operated by whites. So they said, we're going to start our own, and the local Japanese American Citizens League bought the building, also listed in the National Register. There's a wonderful shot of the flower garden in its heyday. You can see that it has a rooftop bar, and they also did delivery. So it was Instacart 70 years ago. And there's the Nisei War Memorial as of 2017. My friend Cam took this photo. The West End retained a lot of the kind of the diverse sorts of housing that we talked about. So there was a mixture of older single-family homes, in some cases mansions that had been converted into multi-family, older SROs or other sorts of hotels and apartments, second-floor apartments, and a very dense, lively, essentially what we'd call today transit-oriented, mixed-use, mixed-income, urban housing. But in the early 50s, they called it blight. This was the cover of a report about the state of Sacramento. You can see, obviously, they went for a very restrained approach for how they were going to present the case for blight in Sacramento. Again, I showed you that Bartholomew and Associates plan. This is another 1930s era plan for what to do with Japantown after they convinced all the Japanese to no longer be there. But there was no way to fund something like this. There wasn't a monetary method. But the method that was embraced was redevelopment. This was created by federal legislation in 1949. And this was a plan that was introduced. This is a Richard Neutra plan, which was based on the earliest version of redevelopment, where the idea was that you would replace housing with housing, and you would keep people in their same neighborhoods rather than displace them somewhere else, but you'd build a new neighborhood for them. Now, this still had consequences. It still wiped out a lot of the heritage and had a lot of there's some rather odd things about this that I'll show you. If you notice on the upper left, there's a sign pointed to the International Bazaar, and that is a sunken underground spot on 4th Street, which would have a Japanese restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and a Mexican restaurant to represent the 3 neighborhoods that had been wiped off of the map in order to create this new downtown. No soul food restaurant, so I assume they figured that the African American community that had been there since the gold rush didn't deserve a restaurant. But even that ended up not happening. Also to the left, you see dormitories. One use of the West End and the waterfront neighborhood was as housing for those industrial workers, about 5,000 of them. And we actually, because migrant labor was the predominant mode of agriculture in the Sacramento Valley, Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. Rather than small family farms, we have large industrial farms. And rather than a small family working the farm, you hire a large workforce that are based in big cities. They're driven out to the farm, work on the farm until the work is done, and then they're sent back with their paychecks. But they have to live somewhere in between, and they lived here in Sacramento. And again, in those hotels, those old boarding houses and things like that. So there was a plan to build a large dormitory that would be capable of holding several thousand migrant workers. This was never built. But the problem is that nobody really wanted to build a neighborhood like that, and the Sacramento's local money men didn't want to put up the money to rebuild downtown Sacramento if it meant that they still had the population there. So they had to wait until 1954, until the Eisenhower administration signed an amendment to redevelopment law that allowed replacement of neighborhoods without replacement of housing. They had to have a plan of some sort, and they made a plan to relocate families. But again, most of the population of the downtown is single men who were part of this workforce, and so they're not eligible for any sort of relocation assistance. They just kind of get displaced. And if you have a business or an established community, they're just kind of too bad. The city's going to take it, and they've got the power of the federal government behind them. And you'll notice that again, a lot of the redevelopment area is also these redlined areas. What a coincidence, because the only way to remove redlining is by removing the population. So that was part of the motivation. And a lot of this racism in code is Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. It's not that the people doing this were all racist guys who would go home and they'd break out their Klan hoods. These weren't necessarily screaming Nazis. These are just bureaucrats. And because the laws were written by people with a racist intent, even if you weren't racist, you could be a banker and want to give a home loan to a black family, but your bank's policy doesn't let you. Or I want to, not that I have anything against you people, but you're just bad for property values. That's institutional racism. Creates a functional equivalent of official government segregation. These interlocking systems of racial exclusion covenants which stop the communities of color from moving out of downtown, and redlining that stops them from reinvesting in downtown. It becomes a trap, and there's not really a way out of it. And the forced way out of it is through redevelopment, essentially casting people to the wind, and it doesn't really matter to the business people if they survive. Part of how this was sold was by marketing the West End as an irredeemable slum, and very often, if you heard about this neighborhood growing up, either you didn't hear about it at all, or you heard that it was a slum. It was Skid Row. It was awful and it was terrible, and all the buildings are falling down, and there's nothing that could be done except bulldoze the whole thing. In many cases, the photos that you see are not photos from the era when the area was the West End. They are from years later, during the redevelopment era, during the construction of Interstate 5, when the rest of downtown was being redeveloped, and these areas had been forcibly abandoned for years. And so you see photos of the vacant spots that had been vacant for years, and they look terrible, of course, but it helps make the sense that what you did was right. This is really what the neighborhoods look like. Again, remember these SRO hotels, they're small. You don't spend a lot of time in them. You spend your time on the street, socializing, communicating, looking for work, looking for a drink, looking for your friends, getting in trouble, sure. And there were at any time maybe a few hundred people who were sleeping on the street because they didn't have enough room left after work or after drinking to be able to afford that hotel. But it was about 5,000 people in SRO hotels and 500 on the street. Now we have about 500 SROs to hotels and about 5,000 people on the street, and that's just in the city. So that equation reversed because the housing was lost. It wasn't the best housing, but it was some housing, and it wasn't replaced. If there's any doubt at all about the racial aspects of redevelopment, a political cartoon like this makes it very clear. And people did try to fight this. This series of color photos shows Sacramento's West End, Japantown in 1954, showing in color, instead of the black and white, kind of the scare photos, photos of a community. And the faces are not necessarily pale European faces. The cars, they're not the newest cars, but they're in good shape. The sidewalks are clean. The buildings are clean. They're occupied. The businesses are there, and the real face of the West End comes out in these photographs in some ways. It's a different perspective of the West End that shows a community that had its obstacles, still couldn't get loans from a bank, but this is a community that also in some cases that did have its own banks. Small and less economically secure than the major ones, but they could do a certain amount of loans, could do a certain amount of new construction, like this Japanese Methodist church, built in 1951, demolished within a decade of its construction because it was blighted, because it was located in the wrong place. Nothing wrong with the physical status of the building. This sixplex apartment building, like others in Midtown that are considered historic buildings today, was considered, there was actually kind of became a trap for housing, where either housing was inappropriate because it was single family home that was converted to multi-use, or it was congested because it was intended to multi-use. So there's no winning scenario for a building. Either it's inappropriate or it's congested. Actually found a photo of a young couple outside this house at a swap meet a while ago. And the ice cream shop right next to the sukiyaki parlor. This is some other new construction, kind of these not so lovable apartment buildings started appearing in Sacramento in the 40s and 50s. And we already had apartment buildings, like I said. They were already around, but they proliferated in the 50s. And this one actually still exists. It was originally at N and 6th Street, and today it's located adjacent to William Land School on V and 12th. And like I said, there were concerted efforts to fight redevelopment and the redevelopment agency. Mayor Clarence Azevedo actually resigned from the redevelopment agency in disgust because they really didn't listen to the community at all, or didn't want to stop the path of progress. And Nathaniel Colley was part of the legal team that was providing opinions and assistance, as well as other attorneys. And I show this photo because I always want to talk about Mr. Bacon, who he was a tile setter who wasn't allowed to join the tile setters union, and so he wasn't able to work in Sacramento because they wouldn't let him join the tile setters union because he was black. And so Nathaniel Colley, who was representing him at the time, said, "Well, you should just get your own contractor's license so you can get jobs on your own as a business contractor rather than trying to join as an employee." And he ended up being so successful at it that he just kept going forward. He ended up winning the case, but he just said, "Well, I'll just run my own business." So I wonder, when I see these old photos of tile, or see tile in downtown Sacramento, how much of that is Bacon tile? And then, of course, within about a decade of coming back from internment, the community was forced to vacate because of redevelopment. And this, one of my favorite color photos of the Hotel Maine, built in 1920. So in this photo, 1954, it's about 30, 35 years old. Not in super great condition, but obviously fully populated with stores. And when you see hotel, remember we're talking about permanent housing here for the most part, just small and economical. And there's also a photo here of the owner of the drugstore providing their own editorial comments as redevelopment and demolition is starting in earnest across the street. And, I consider blight to be an imaginary disease of buildings, curable only with bulldozers, caused because the people inside them are the wrong color for the people with the money. So what happened to the people who lived in these neighborhoods? Well, they picked up, moved somewhere else, and started again. The period I like to call the Sacramento Renaissance, because a lot of people will talk about this era as an era of decline for places like Oak Park, because people who were escaping demolition of their community started anew. St. Andrews AME was originally where the Sacramento County offices are located, off of 7th and G Street, and they moved to Southside Park. This is on the other side of the Southside Park from the Fong Mansion. Shiloh Baptist Church, which was originally at 6th and O, where Capitol Towers is today, they saw what was coming. They owned their land, and so they sold it and bought property in Oak Park, again unrestricted, built a new church designed by Sacramento's first African-American architect, James Dodd, and got out of the way of redevelopment, which, as you can see here, some of these maps pretty much clearly show that the bulldozers that were supposed to destroy, that destroyed the West End, were supposed to keep going all the way pretty much until Alhambra Boulevard. This map shows that there's all these terrible, decayed, awful buildings all the way through what they called the Old City back then. This is from the 1960 General Plan, I believe, or the Housing Act of 1954 requires that a community to be eligible for federal assistance to urban and rural activities must prepare and administer a workable program. And the program is supposed to go, like I said, all the way to the old city limits and build an entirely new neighborhood on more geometric, more of those looks good from orbit lines, not so much from the sidewalk, with what was then called Euclidean zoning, based on a legal decision called Euclid versus Ambler, where instead of having a neighborhood which was mixed use, where you might have commercial and industrial and office and residential in relatively close proximity to each other, they would be separated by clear lines of demarcation, again, very often with the best of intent, that smoky, sooty, stinky 19th century industry was not good for the health of 19th century people. Open plumbing, open sewers, lack of sanitary facilities is not good for anybody. But instead of solving the problems of cities, we decided to escape the problems of cities by putting the offices in one place and the houses in the other and connecting them with freeways. But these new places, the suburbs, were not available to communities of color. They were only accessible generally if you were white and middle class, which meant a lot of people were locked out. 1963, the Rumford Fair Housing Act was passed. African-American legislator Byron Rumford said, okay, it's time to do away with racial exclusion covenants. And he was successful. However, a year later, the California Association of Realtors passed Proposition 14, which says, no, we want to keep racial exclusion covenants. And we'll talk more about specifically why in a little bit. But there were other things going on. Freeway construction. You saw the highway construction that was going on that was planned for the central city, but also running through places like Oak Park. In many cases, this was a method to get from downtown to the suburbs, but it meant that if you had a freeway, you didn't have to go downtown unless you wanted to do for a job. Then you could get out as soon as possible. But they also served the purpose of essentially becoming a wall between white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. Let's see if I can get the video to work here and the sound. Let me know if the sound's not working. This is Ginger Rutland.
35th Street, Oak Park, once a bustling shopping center, now a burned out shell, symbol of a ghetto. I'm Ginger Rutland, KCRA News, and I'll be taking a fresh look at Oak Park, my old neighborhood.
What happened to Oak Park? You were here when it happened, and I'd like an explanation.
Well, I'm part of the influx of blacks from the West End during the when 3rd Street was and the West End was redeveloped, and I feel that because of the designated efforts from the Real Estate Association in those years, this was part of what I call the beginning of the destruction of Oak Park. And I feel that whatever has happened to Oak Park, that was the seed planted. And
what exactly did they do? They designated.
Well, when people were being replaced in the around 2nd, 3rd, in the West End, I was on across the street from our Crocker's Art Gallery when we came to Sacramento in 1942. When they started designating where people were going to go in order to have them get out of the way, they designated blacks to Oak Park. And of course, if you look for a house, you were told that there was no place they could put you except Oak Park. So quite a number of us were geared toward Oak Park because we wanted a decent place to live. Oak Park was a beautiful place at that time. and people were moved in here overnight. There was an effort to blockbust. This really happened because I worked out here in the early years of Sacramento. I worked on 12th Avenue, 11th Avenue, 33rd. I caught the trolley out here. I brought my baby to Well Baby Clinics, which is at McGeorge's Law School now. And this is how the wholesale destruction of Oak Park started. You know, and once the blacks started to coming in here, I believe Roy Taylor was on the corner 33rd and 6th Avenue. Beautiful store there. Even Roy Taylor was frightened and moved out of here wholesale once the blacks, and he's on Stockton, he's on Freeport Boulevard now.
What happened to the white people? When the blacks moved in, what happened to the
Well,
white people?
there were efforts, and I think this can be substantiated, to put it bluntly, Ginger. Well, there were quite a few old Italian families and all out here, and the niggers are coming, so you better get, before you would fumigate and sterilize a house before you'd have a family move out. But I actually saw people move in this area overnight during that time. And with all this fear, the blacks, the whites moved out. People who had beautiful backyards with roses, who had fruits. They had built those, planted the yards and gardens for a lifetime, and they were frightened, and they sold the property, and they got out of here. And consequently, blacks also have the same middle-class concept. When the whites started moving out, quite a few of the blacks decided, you know, we're going to have all the people from second and third. You know, blacks don't all associate together either.
That was a story by Blanche Hill, who was a neighborhood activist in Oak Park. And one term that she mentioned that I wanted to draw attention to is blockbusting. Now, what that meant was, remember, we talked about racial covenants, and essentially what happened in a neighborhood that became a black neighborhood, or a neighborhood of color of any sort, is that once it was redlined, property values would go down. And blockbusting was done, essentially was a strategy used by realtors that took advantage of the fact that racial covenants meant that people of color couldn't buy everywhere. They could only buy in certain places. And by designating a neighborhood, as you mentioned, this wasn't something the redevelopment agency did. The city didn't say, oh, the black community should move to Oak Park. Realtors did this. And by suggesting to a neighborhood that it was going to become a black neighborhood, or that black people were moving in, very often they would hire a young black woman to push a baby carriage around the neighborhood, even whether she lived there or not, to give the hint to the white residents, this is becoming a black neighborhood, time to sell as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible in order to get out before the neighborhood becomes redlined, because before the property value drops dramatically. And that's exactly what happened. So realtors are able to buy these properties at fire sale prices and then turn them around to the African-American customer, who, again, can't buy everywhere, so they can charge a very high price. And that differential between the high price that they can charge and the low price they're buying it for is hugely profitable. So again, there's a profit motive that reinforces the need to keep a racist law in place. And that's why Proposition 14 was created, and that's why it was fought by the real estate industry.
What part does redlining play in the decline of Oak Park?
I think one of the major things that have occurred since redlining started is that some of your mortgage companies and local banks won't loan money into this community so that people can, in fact, repair their homes that need to be refurbished, or, in fact, from their standpoint, without question, I don't think they've loaned any money in this area in the last 10 years. I would think they would consider Oak Park being a disaster area, an area that no one wants to live in, and I think one of the project area committee's objectives is to improve this improve this community. And we also have the option of using at the present time redevelopment agency for subsidized housing in this community, but we're not getting any monies coming in from our local loan associations or banks, and specifically banks in this community are not lending any money for building.
Okay. One kind of a side issue about redevelopment is that redevelopment disrupted neighborhoods and relocated people. And very often the people who were moved to this community, especially young people, felt like refugees. They were being kicked out of their own homes for profit, losing their communities, losing their connections. And some of the steps that were taken were to become activists, and more so than folks like Nathaniel Colley and the kind of the generation of the 1940s and 50s, where essentially this was an emerging black middle class. This was more of a working class approach. This was a revolutionary approach, and that's what the Black Panther Party was. Of course, the Black Panther Party started in Oakland, but they made their splash on the national scene here in Sacramento when they marched into the state capitol, and Sacramento started its own chapter. And Akinsanya Kambon was an artist he was a Sacramentan Vietnam veteran who created the Black Panther Party logo and the legendary Black Panther Party coloring book. Now, Proposition 14 was beaten at the Supreme Court by none other than Nathaniel Colley and a team of legal experts. And who's that young fellow to the left there? That's Robert Matsui, future first Japanese American City of Sacramento council member, and of course, member of Congress. Now, during this period, within the central city, there are a lot of the older buildings are being demolished and replaced with apartments. And in some cases, communities are responding to redevelopment with their own solutions. This is downtown. Many people recognize this pagoda-shaped building in downtown Sacramento, the Wong Center, but it is part of a deliberate effort by the Chinese community to redevelop their own neighborhood, but to do it differently. Instead of redevelopment like Capitol Mall, which had no housing and was an effort to displace a community, redevelopment of Chinatown was done. It was in part used redevelopment funds, but in part used private investments, including William Fong Wei, whose mansion we saw earlier, was one of the investors in this, to create a community that was modern in design, but reflected traditional Chinese architecture, but also provided housing, provided offices and meeting spaces for family associations, and also was designed by Chinese American architects, including Sacramento native Suki Lee, who's best known for Pancake Circus and the current remodel of Frank Fat's. So it was a different sort of expression of redevelopment. The idea that redevelopment could be a public good if it served the people whose communities were being affected, as well as the interests of capital. And the Latino community also responded. A lot of the Latino community, following redevelopment, it was pushed into Alkali Flat, which was zoned commercial, which means any residential use was officially not supposed to happen. There weren't supposed to be any residences in Alkali Flat because it was all supposed to be an expansion of downtown. And their response was also redevelopment and creating affordable housing on the north end around what's now Zapata Park of Alkali Flat. What was the results of redevelopment? In 1950, there were 58,000 people in Sacramento's central city. You can see the darker squares are the higher population areas, the darkest being right along the waterfront, what's now Old Sacramento, and that's where all those thousands of laborers worked. 1970, you lost 30,000 people. 28,000 people were left. 1990, things bumped back up to around 32,000. And how did that happen? We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then by 2010, it actually dropped back down. So what happened here? You can see the population of the city overall exploded. All the old city, the central city, dropped, and downtown dropped even farther. Population of the county exploded even more. Again, this is suburban development, moving out from the city, and then forcible relocation. But there was also a counter movement that started in the 1970s of young counterculture folks who were in the act of rediscovering their downtown. And many of its spaces they felt were underutilized or they were available. So this old workshop became a arts and crafts dealer. Of course, it's a workshop again. Actually, if you're familiar with Barbershop Automotive, they caught fire last year and they're moving into this. They already had a scooter shop there. And then young professionals who were, because Sacramento is transitioning from being an industrial city to being an information-based economy. and with an expanded state government in the post-war era to reflect the fact that California was exploding economically and in population, moved downtown, and they wanted to fix up some of these old houses. Instead of living in an apartment, they wanted to live downtown in a house. But the problem was that this area was still redlined. Racial exclusion covenants were gotten rid of in 1967. Redlining was still around until the 70s, so you couldn't get a home loan. So one of the first challenges is, how do you get a loan? And a lot of the impetus of this new community, these new folks moving downtown, was getting rid of redlining once and for all. And also, you couldn't get a building permit because these old buildings didn't match modern building codes, and so they created alternative codes. This is the Ricella family, Bob Ricella on the left and Roberta Ricella second to the right, and then Stephen Ballou on the far right was also an early activist and advocate for historic homes. But of course, like other places that get colonized, this was not an unoccupied place. And the communities that had been relocated for the West End, a lot of them were still here in Sacramento. This is the Royal Chicano Air Force, an arts group, as part of the Sacramento's Latino community, but they were already here. And they were making their mark all over the city with art, with culture, with music, with public events, and inspired by the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program, the Breakfast for Niños program at Washington Neighborhood Center. And so these groups were also starting to make their presence known. But seeing these other groups come in, so, well, if we're going to be part of this community, we'd better get loud. And they also made use of old buildings. And the idea of adaptive reuse has been around, and the idea that old buildings can serve new purposes. And the RCAF imprinted new layers of meaning, not only through art and activism and organization, but through use of space and building community. Another thing that's happening is that Jerry Brown, elected governor, did away with what was called the Capital Area Plan. Now, in between 64 and 67, when Proposition 14 passed, all of California's redevelopment money was cut off. It wasn't available because we were basically doing something officially racist. We were violating the Civil Rights Act, so we couldn't get redevelopment funds. So the governor then, Brown Sr., said, well, let's buy this square mile south of the Capitol and turn it into a giant state office complex. And that was well underway through the 60s, and a lot of buildings that that people know and kind of feel okay about between N and P Street were constructed during this era. But in the 70s, this new group came in, including this group of mostly UC Berkeley students like Dennis Bilo and Jackie Whitelam, and started drawing new maps of what could happen in downtown. And what it looked like was a lot like the neighborhood that the redevelopment agency had just got done demolishing, but with a modern edge, with a green edge, using passive solar design features for apartments, using traditional ideas of neighborhoods, but with some new twists, design-wise and technology-wise, in order to create a new green community for these young people, and an increasingly diverse community of young people, because the state workforce, which had originally back in the 50s, part of the idea of Sacramento becoming the hub of state government and being a government town was because the workforce that was working in the canneries, in the shops, in the West End were communities of color and increasingly unionized. And local powers that didn't like that. They wanted a workforce that was white and non-unionized, and they figured state workers filled the bill. But the problem for them is that over the course of the 60s and 70s, the state workforce became far more multiracial and multicultural, and also got a union. But I'm sorry, they had a question?
Yeah, there are two questions in the comment section. Matthew's asking about how many people live in the central city today.
So we're still waiting on the 2020 census, but the estimates that I've seen are about 35,000. So we're back on an upswing population-wise.
And then the next question was, didn't Paul and Jackie become CADA directors?
Yes. No, I got some of these images from Jackie. Another population that was moving into the central city is now part of the Lavender Heights. So early gay activists, lesbian activists were moving, and part of this community was moving to downtown Sacramento, like the counterculture kids, for acceptance, for room to breathe, because they had jobs downtown. And so institutions like Earhart's Cafe or the Western, now the Depot, emerged then, and these kind of they sort of become the bellwethers for redevelopment as young people, LGBT communities, and counterculture kids. And a lot of these activists formed organizations like Sacramento Old City Association to look at what else could we do with downtown. And that's also in the era of the 70s and early 80s is the first concerns about gentrification. So we're talking about it today, but it's not a new thing. This has been a story that's been going on, and part of why it's been a back burner issue really until, in some cases, to the early 21st century, is that there were moderating influences on gentrification. In part, it was because the people who were moving downtown were not wealthy. They were middle class, they were professionals, they weren't rich. And instead of wanting to live in a place that was now going to be a rich neighborhood and taking more proactive steps to displace, they wanted to live in a place that was diverse. They wanted to live in a place where not everybody looked like them or made as much money or spoke the same language. They wanted to live in this diverse, rich environment that now we call Midtown. And they also started building new housing, just as the community did, as the community of the West End did following the Second World War. So first examples of infill. And during the 80s, there was a building boom going on. There was a housing shortage in the 80s because not many people were building housing downtown, but there was a massive interest in offices. And so there were actually a lot of battles between the community and development, and with the city kind of trying to play middle ground regarding whether downtown was going to be offices or housing. And the redevelopment plan from the 50s just said, yeah, offices, except maybe a little bit of housing, maybe some apartments. But the people had another idea. There were also art galleries moving into downtown Sacramento. We associate art galleries more with Midtown, but up through the early 80s, it was mostly downtown. Now you've got Claudia Chaplin here of the Idea Gallery off of J Street. And then 3 years later, this smiling young woman, it's like, gosh, it was just a couple years later, but she looks like she's aged, partially because the rent was tripled because they wanted to rent the former art gallery space, which was possible because the rent was cheap and the demand was low, as office space, which is worth much more. So that kind of displacement, not through redevelopment, but through economic means, through gentrification, is already taking place. The other bellwether of gentrification is Young Punks. These are some kids out on 21st Street at the I Dream Ice Cream protesting its demolition for a parking lot, which is still there today. It was supposed to be a Whole Foods, speaking of bellwethers of gentrification, but that didn't work out for various reasons. Downtown and Midtown, the earliest references to Midtown that I see are about 1940. The Midtown Pharmacy. In the 80s, it was the Grinding Stone, which is owned by Nate Shiner, the local musician. And now it's Luna's Cafe, absolutely an institution of community art, and owned by CADA. So protected largely because it's under CADA's ownership. But that's, in some cases, I think it's sort of the birthplace of Midtown in terms of it's the earliest reference to a store that has Midtown in its name. We had our own cafes like Pava's. This is a photo by Joe Perfecto. And then if there's any doubt that Midtown Sacramento was starting to gentrify in the early 80s, a wine bar named Fiasco, which advertised over 50 Chardonnays. This was not where farmers went to knock the dirt off of their shoes. This was where yuppies went to drink a lot of Chardonnay. But housing, the development community hadn't caught on yet. They still assumed that nobody wanted to live downtown, and so buildings like the Francesca Apartments here, despite the fact that the ground floor was the home of David's Brass Rail, Jerry Brown's favorite bar, but it blocked the view of Capitol Park from a new hotel behind it, so it was demolished. And those apartments, this is the Merriam Apartments at 14th Street, which was in the way of the new convention center. There was a battle where the young people who lived in the building joined forces with the activists, who by then had formed the Sacramento Old City Association, had really formed into a major force in the central city. Made a concerted effort to save the building, but the complaint was, well, who wants to live in these tiny little apartments downtown with no parking? Okay, not sure how many of you read the Business Journal, but this is exactly the kind of housing they're building now at much greater expense and much higher rents. But we already had them. We just got rid of them because they were not popular with the building community. Standing in the wreckage of the Clooney Hotel, or Kevin Marvelli and his band 7 Seconds. So new plans were being forged for the central city based on this combat of forces. This is the shows neighborhood land use trends 1960 to 74, and a lot of the white space that you see here are commercial areas and redevelopment areas, and what the city then called the frame, which is the idea there would be these vehicular corridors and business corridors through the central city like a tic-tac-toe board, and then residential areas between them, which would be mostly high residential or mostly high density. But over time, as neighborhoods around it, they were all zones, very low density, single family. There would be very few corners of low density in this new central city, and still very much this idea of the frame where commercial corridors would be where all the traffic was, and neighbors would be sort of in the middle. And that's a battle that's still going on right now. This is from the 2030 general plan. And you can see this is sort of on these maps, the more livid the color, the more dense the use. So there's kind of light lemon yellow is very low density suburban. And then the slightly darker yellow is traditional neighborhood low. There's neighborhoods like East Sacramento and Land Park and much of Oak Park. And then the orange that you see there is traditional neighborhood medium. That's Midtown and parts of Oak Park and North Sacramento. And then the red is high rise and commercial, and that frame that I talked about. But when you look at this map and compare it to the redlining map from the 1930s, the red areas are still the same. And now we're pretty close to an hour and a half, and I don't want to go over. So I do have some more, but I'd like to stop and take a pause and see if there are any questions. And then I don't know, for the organizers, how long do we have, or when do we actually have to stop?
So we had this planned until 6:30, but I mean, if anybody has any questions right now, I think they're free to ask. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Marion Millen says, shout out to Tim Holt. A lot of the photos of newspapers you saw there are from Suttertown News, which is a wonderful local newspaper. It started in the 70s as Suttertown Good Time News, and reported on a lot of these issues and documented them. I got to interview Tim for a couple of books. Okay. In the interest of not going over time, then perhaps if we want to do a second session later, we could talk about it and potentially do one more on contemporary issues and events of the past few years.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you so much for educating us tonight. This was an awesome presentation. They're always chock full of information, so thank you so much.
Yeah.
And for those of you who came tonight, be looking out for a follow-up email. It will have information about how you can get involved in some of the local housing struggles that are going on right now. So yes, please be looking out for that.
Do you have a couple questions coming in now? If we got a couple minutes, I could answer them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question about the hotel that was demolished on K. That was the Clooney Hotel, and that's where the Renaissance Tower, aka the Darth Vader building, is now. The pit on the other side of the street, that happened after a fire in 2006. And then mentioned high ground areas and the native communities lived around Capitol Park. I don't know too much specific information about communities, but there were multiple inhabited areas throughout the central city. There was Sacumne near West City Hall, and Sama near the city cemetery, Kadema, which is actually further out towards Watt Avenue, and there were about a dozen different communities. I don't know specifically about one in Capitol Park, but the thing is that hill that the Capitol is on is artificial. So it was raised, so it wasn't a natural rise other than the fact that it was just a little bit farther inland. But thank you everyone for your time, and well, I guess we'll find out when the next one is.
Thank you. Yeah, we will definitely be reaching out to you in a bit, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting tonight.
Thank you so much for coming. This was phenomenal.
Thank you so much for this.